There's a specific kind of silence that isn't empty. It's the silence of someone who once absorbed everything. Every glance, every unspoken word, every emotional tremor in a room, and then one day simply stopped. Not because they became numb, not because they stopped feeling, but because they finally recognized something most people spend a lifetime running from, that the person they believed themselves to be was never actually them at all. And if that sentence unsettled something inside you, stay here. Because what you're about to understand isn't about becoming someone new. It's about recognizing who you were before you learned to become what everyone else needed. Think about someone you once knew who seemed almost impossibly present. They remembered details others forgot. They noticed the slight shift in your voice before you even registered your own mood. People gravitated toward them like warmth toward a fire. And then, something shifted. They grew distant. Not cold exactly, but unreachable in a way that felt almost deliberate. Conversations became shorter. Responses arrived later. The endless emotional availability simply evaporated. And if you're honest, you might have thought, they've changed. They've become selfish. They've lost what made them special. But here's what almost no one understands. What looks like withdrawal from the outside is often something entirely different when viewed from within. It is not the death of compassion. It is the birth of discernment. And Carl Jung, who mapped the hidden architecture of the human psyche more precisely than perhaps anyone in modern history, recognized this moment as something far more significant than personality change. He saw it as the threshold where an individual stops being a reflection of others and begins the long, difficult journey toward becoming themselves. The question isn't whether they stopped caring. The question is what they finally started protecting. If you've ever felt yourself pulling back from the emotional weight you once carried without question, if you've sensed something shifting inside you that you can't quite name, or if you're watching someone you love become distant and wondering whether to grieve that loss or understand it, then what follows may reorder how you see everything, not because it offers simple answers, but because it illuminates a path that most people never even realize exists. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Absorption. Before we can understand why someone would stop caring, we have to understand what caring actually meant for them in the first place. And this is where the first uncomfortable truth emerges. For the person who becomes known as deeply perceptive, deeply feeling, deeply attuned, what the world casually labels an empath, the capacity to feel others was rarely a choice. It was an adaptation. A survival strategy constructed so early and so quietly that it became indistinguishable from identity itself. Picture a child in a household where emotional weather shifted without warning, where a parent's mood determined whether the evening would be peaceful or treacherous, where safety depended not on what was said, but on what could be detected beneath the words. That child learns something that will shape their entire nervous system: vigilance. They learn to scan faces before anyone speaks, to register the subtle tightening of a jaw, the almost imperceptible change in breathing. The way silence can mean 10 different things depending on who is holding it. And they learn that their own needs, their own internal state, is secondary to this constant monitoring. Not because anyone told them this explicitly, but because the cost of missing a cue was simply too high. This is not empathy as a virtue. This is empathy as a defense mechanism. And here is where Jung's insight cuts through decades of misunderstanding. He recognized that what we call personality is often not an expression of self, but a carefully constructed response to environment. The child who becomes exquisitely attuned to others is not necessarily more loving by nature. They are more threatened, more aware that connection is conditional, more certain that being easy, being helpful, being undemanding is the price of belonging. Over time, this pattern doesn't remain a conscious strategy. It sinks below awareness, becomes automatic, The person no longer thinks I must read this room to stay safe. They simply find themselves knowing what others feel, absorbing it, carrying it. And because this ability is genuinely useful to others, because it makes them valuable as listeners, as supports, as the one everyone turns to, the pattern is reinforced from every direction. They are praised for being understanding, needed for being present, celebrated for being selfless, and slowly, imperceptibly, the adaptation becomes the identity. But there's a cost that no one sees, a quiet erosion that happens beneath the surface of all this apparent virtue. When a person's primary orientation is outward, when their nervous system is perpetually tuned to frequencies outside themselves, something essential begins to atrophy, not their ability to feel others, but their ability to feel themselves. They lose contact with their own internal compass. Their own desires become faint, then foreign. They might be asked what they want and genuinely not know, not because they're indecisive, but because the muscle of self-reference has become so weak from disuse. And this is where the exhaustion comes from, not from giving too much. That's the surface explanation. The deeper truth is that they've been operating without a center, without a home base to return to. Every interaction requires them to leave themselves entirely and inhabit another's emotional landscape. And when there's no self to come back to, no internal ground that feels solid and real, then every departure becomes a small death. Every conversation depletes something that never gets replenished. Jung described this state with a precision that still cuts. The individual has not yet separated from their early identifications. They are still living inside the adaptation that childhood required, still performing the role that once kept them safe, still believing that this performance is who they actually are. And the tragedy is that from the outside, this looks like virtue. It looks like kindness. It looks like emotional intelligence, which makes it almost impossible to question. How do you tell someone that their most admired quality might actually be a symptom? How do you suggest that their exhaustion isn't from loving too much, but from having never learned how to exist without merging? You can't. Not from the outside. This recognition has to come from within. And it usually arrives not as insight, but as collapse. Not as wisdom, but as a kind of spiritual bankruptcy, where the old ways simply stop working. Where the energy that once sustained the pattern is gone. Where the role that once provided meaning suddenly feels like a cage. This is the moment that looks, from the outside, like someone stopping caring. But what's actually happening is far more significant. They are not abandoning compassion. They are abandoning a version of compassion that required their own disappearance. And until you understand what that disappearance costs, you cannot understand why stopping it is not selfishness, but the first genuine act of self-preservation they may have ever performed. So here's the question that sits beneath everything that follows. What would you discover about yourself if you stopped performing the role that everyone else finds so valuable? Who would remain when the constant outward orientation finally ceased? And why does the answer to that question terrify most people more than the exhaustion itself? Chapter 2. The Invisible Economy. When someone who has spent a lifetime absorbing the emotional weight of others begins to withdraw, the people around them rarely respond with understanding. They respond with confusion, then disappointment, then often something closer to resentment. And this reaction reveals something that the empath themselves has never consciously recognized. They were not just being kind. They were participating in an economy, an invisible exchange that everyone else understood, even if no one ever named it. Every relationship operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the surface level, the conversations, the shared experiences, the expressed affection. And then there's the energetic level, the subtle, often unconscious flow of emotional material between people. Who carries the anxiety? Who absorbs the tension? Who becomes the designated container for what others cannot hold? In most relationships, this flow is relatively balanced. Both people give and receive. Both people sometimes carry more, and sometimes are carried. The economy is mutual, even if imperfect. But for the person we're describing, the economy has never been mutual. They have functioned not as a trading partner, but as a resource. An emotional aquifer that others draw from, without ever considering whether it replenishes. And the most destabilizing part? They participated in this arrangement willingly. Not because they were exploited in any obvious sense, but because the role of giver was the only role they knew how to inhabit. Being needed felt like being valued. Being the one who listened, who understood, who never demanded reciprocity. This felt like purpose, like identity, like the only way they knew to matter. But every aquifer has limits. Every resource that is drawn from without replenishment will eventually run dry. And the moment it does, something fascinating happens. The same people who benefited from the flow, who relied on the availability, who never questioned whether the source might have its own needs, these people suddenly find the new boundaries unacceptable. Not because the boundaries are wrong, but because they've become accustomed to a one-way flow. They've built their own emotional stability on the assumption that this person will always absorb, always accommodate, always be there. When that assumption breaks, the reaction is rarely gratitude for all that was given. It's more often a kind of bewildered offense. You've changed. You're not the person I knew. You've become so distant. And notice what's missing from these statements. Any acknowledgement that the previous arrangement might have been unsustainable. Any curiosity about what it cost to maintain it for so long. Any question about whether the person they're accusing of changing might finally be doing something they've never done before. Protecting themselves. This is the first time the empath truly sees the economy for what it was. They see that their relationships were often structured around their depletion. That their value in others' lives was tied to what they provided, not who they were. That their presence was appreciated primarily because it made others' lives easier, not because they were seen as a full human being with their own needs, their own limits, their own right to say no. This recognition is devastating. It can feel like discovering that you were never actually loved, only used. And for a time, this perception may harden into bitterness. But Jung understood something crucial about this phase. The bitterness, the anger, the sudden clarity about how one-sided everything has been. These are not the final destination. They are necessary. They are the psyche's way of breaking the old pattern, of creating enough distance, enough friction, enough discomfort that the person cannot simply slide back into the familiar role. The anger is not the problem. The anger is the alarm system. It signals that something fundamental has to change. What makes this transition so difficult is that the empath has no template for what comes next. They know how to be available. They know how to absorb. They know how to make themselves small so others can expand. But they don't know how to exist in relationships where they are not the designated carrier. They don't know how to receive without immediately feeling indebted. They don't know how to take up space without apologizing. And so the initial withdrawal can feel like isolation, like loneliness, like they've lost something essential, even though what they've actually lost is a pattern that was slowly consuming them. Here's the paradox that sits at the center of this transformation. They didn't stop caring because they became cold. They stopped caring in the old way, because the old way was never actually caring at all. It was fusion. It was self-abandonment dressed up as love. It was a childhood survival strategy that had outlived its usefulness, but never been replaced by anything more mature. And the exhaustion, the depletion, the growing sense of emptiness, these were not signs that they needed to try harder. They were signs that the entire approach had to die. So if you're in this place, if you feel yourself pulling back, if you sense that the old ways of relating no longer fit, if you're watching relationships shift or dissolve because you can't keep giving in the same way, pause. This is not failure. This is not becoming a worse person. This is the first honest moment in what may have been years of unconscious performance. And what's emerging in the space where the old pattern used to live is not emptiness. It's something you've never had room to discover. Chapter 3. The Mask and the Mirror. If you've ever wondered why it's so difficult to stop being the person everyone needs you to be, the answer lies in a concept Jung returned to throughout his work: the persona. The persona is the social mask, the version of ourselves we present to the world. And contrary to how we often think about masks, the persona is not inherently false. It's necessary. It allows us to function in society without exposing every internal fluctuation. It's the interface between our inner world and the outer world's demands. But for the person who has built their identity around being emotionally available, the persona has done something dangerous. It has stopped being a tool and become a prison. They are no longer choosing to be understanding. They are compelled to be understanding. They are no longer deciding to listen. They are incapable of not listening. The mask has fused with the face, and they cannot tell where the performance ends and the self begins. Think about the moments when you've smiled while exhausted, said it's fine while something inside you screamed, listened to someone's problems while your own internal world was collapsing. Each of these moments seems small, insignificant, just being polite, just being kind. But accumulated over years, they become something else. They become a habit of self-erasure, a reflex of prioritizing others' comfort over your own truth. And the most insidious part? You get rewarded for it. Told you're mature, told you're easy to be around, told you're such a good listener. The external validation makes the mask feel like identity, and identity feels like destiny. You start to believe that this is simply who you are. Someone who cares, someone who understands, someone who puts others first, and the possibility that there might be something else underneath, something less accommodating, something with edges, something that doesn't always want to understand, becomes not just foreign but threatening. Because if that's true, then who have you been all this time? Jung described this with uncomfortable precision. A person can live an entire lifetime as a version of themselves that both they and others believe to be real, while the living core within them is pushed further and further into the background. The persona occupies the center. The self becomes a stranger, and the distance between them grows so gradually that it's almost impossible to notice until something breaks. What breaks it is usually not insight. It's exhaustion. There comes a point where the performance simply cannot be sustained. The energy required to maintain the mask exceeds what the person has available. And in that moment of depletion, something else emerges. Something that has been waiting in the shadows of the psyche for years, perhaps decades. Anger, resentment, the desire to simply stop, to say no without explanation, to withdraw without apology. And this is where most people, including the empath themselves, misinterpret what's happening. They think the anger is the problem. They think the withdrawal is a sign that they've become a worse person. They try to push these feelings back down, to return to the familiar performance of being good, being understanding, being available. But the feelings don't disappear. They just go underground, where they continue to accumulate pressure. What Jung understood, and what almost no one teaches, is that these negative feelings are not corruption, they are communication. The anger is not proof that you've lost your compassion. It's proof that you've abandoned yourself so completely that only something as forceful as anger could get your attention. The resentment is not a character flaw. It's a signal that the economy has been one-sided for too long. The desire to withdraw is not coldness. It's the psyche's attempt to create enough space to breathe. When the empath begins to stop caring in the old, automatic way, they are not becoming less moral. They are becoming more honest. They are finally allowing themselves to acknowledge what they actually feel, rather than what they're supposed to feel. And this honesty, while uncomfortable, is the first genuine step towards something more real. Because you cannot build an authentic life on a foundation of performed virtue. You cannot sustain genuine connection through self-erasure. The mask has to crack before the face can be seen. And here's the question that sits at this threshold. If you stopped being the person everyone expects you to be, if you let the mask fall, if you allowed yourself to be inconvenient, to have needs, to say no without a carefully crafted explanation, who would remain? What would be left when the performance ended? And why does the answer to that question feel like both freedom and annihilation at the same time? Chapter 4. The darkness we carry. There's a particular kind of discomfort that arises when you start to suspect that you're not quite as pure as you've believed yourself to be. Not quite as selfless. Not quite as free of the darker impulses you've always associated with other people. This discomfort is not accidental. It's the first glimpse of what Jung called the shadow. And for the person who has built their identity around being good, being understanding, being emotionally available, the shadow is not just uncomfortable. It's terrifying. The shadow is everything we cannot accept about ourselves. The desires we disown, the anger we suppress, the selfishness we refuse to acknowledge. And contrary to popular understanding, the shadow is not just about obvious darkness, cruelty, greed, violence. For the empath, the shadow often contains something far more subtle and far more threatening, the simple desire to stop, to not care, to prioritize oneself, to say I don't have space for this and mean it. These impulses feel like betrayal. They feel like evidence that you're secretly a bad person, that your kindness has all been a performance, that underneath the understanding exterior lurks something selfish and cold. And so you push these feelings away. You deny them. You redouble your efforts to be good, to be available, to prove to yourself that the shadow isn't real. But Jung's insight here is both brutal and liberating. What we push into the unconscious does not disappear. It accumulates. It waits, and eventually, it finds expression, not through conscious choice, but through exhaustion, through resentment, through the sudden, inexplicable inability to keep caring the way you used to. Think about the last time you felt a flash of irritation at someone who needed you. The last time you listened to someone's problems and felt, underneath your attentive expression, a quiet scream of "I cannot hold one more thing." The last time you said yes while something inside you was desperately trying to say no. These moments are not failures of character. They are the shadow trying to speak, trying to tell you that the current arrangement is unsustainable, that the version of love you've been practicing requires your own disappearance, that something has to change before you break entirely. Jung wrote something that should stop every empath in their tracks. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, not by becoming more perfect, not by eliminating every selfish impulse, but by acknowledging what's already there, by facing the parts of yourself you've been taught to despise, by recognizing that the desire to stop caring is not evidence of corruption. It's evidence that you've been carrying too much for too long, and something inside you is finally demanding relief. What happens when you actually do this? When you stop fighting the shadow and instead turn toward it with curiosity? Something unexpected. The feelings that seemed so threatening when they were suppressed begin to lose their power when they're acknowledged. The anger, once named, becomes information rather than contamination. The resentment, once allowed to exist, reveals what it's been trying to protect. The desire to withdraw, once honored, becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. You discover that the shadow is not your enemy. It's the part of you that has been trying to keep you alive while the persona was busy performing. It's the part that knows your limits even when you refuse to acknowledge them. It's the part that says enough when the conscious mind keeps saying just a little more. And integrating it, not eliminating it, but making room for it, listening to it, letting it inform your choices. This is not a descent into selfishness. It's the beginning of actually being whole. The empath who has begun this integration is different in ways that can be unsettling to others. They still care, but not automatically. They still listen, but not endlessly. They still show up, but not at the expense of their own existence. From the outside, this can look like they've lost something, like their compassion has diminished. But what's actually happened is that their compassion has been relocated. It's no longer an unconscious reflex. It's a conscious choice. And a choice can be made wisely. A choice can consider the cost. A choice can include oneself in the circle of concern. So here's the question that the shadow asks, and that most people spend their lives avoiding. What would you find if you stopped performing goodness and started being honest? What would emerge if you let the anger speak instead of swallowing it? What version of care might become possible if it no longer required your own erasure? Chapter 5. The Inner Architecture. If you've followed this journey so far, you might be sensing a pattern. The empath's exhaustion isn't from feeling too much. It's from having no container strong enough to hold what they feel. They're like water without banks. Pure, receptive, but constantly flooding into every available space. And without boundaries, without structure, without something solid to return to, they cannot sustain presence. They can only dissolve. This is where Jung's understanding of the psyche offers something that most discussions of empathy completely miss. He recognized that psychological maturity requires balance between what he called the anima and animus. Not simply masculine and feminine in the gender sense, but the principles of receptivity and discernment, of feeling and structure, of openness and boundary. The empath has developed the receptive pole to an extraordinary degree. They feel what others feel. They sense what's unspoken. They absorb the emotional atmosphere of any room they enter. This is a genuine capacity, not just a trauma response. But when one pole develops without the counterbalance of the other, it stops being a strength and becomes a vulnerability. The empath can feel everything, but they cannot distinguish between what belongs to them and what doesn't. They can sense others' pain, but they cannot decide whether to carry it. They are exquisitely attuned, but they have no volume control, no filter, no way to modulate their own exposure. They are a radio receiver with no off switch, picking up every signal whether they want to or not. The turning point comes not when they learn to feel less, but when they begin to develop the internal structure that can hold what they feel. This is not about becoming hard. It's about becoming coherent. It's about developing an inner axis, a center of gravity that doesn't shift every time someone else's emotional weather changes. It's about learning to say, I feel this, but it's not mine without that distinction feeling like abandonment. This development is subtle. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic breakthroughs. It shows up in small, almost invisible shifts. They notice that they can listen to someone's pain without immediately absorbing it. They can be present without merging. They can care without carrying. They find themselves saying no, not with guilt and elaborate justification, but with simple clarity. They discover that they can protect their energy without becoming cold, that boundaries and compassion are not opposites, that the same receptivity that once exhausted them can become sustainable when it's held within a structure strong enough to contain it. One person who moved through this transformation described it this way. She had always believed that understanding someone meant staying with their pain until it resolved. But she began to realize that understanding doesn't require staying. She could see someone's suffering clearly, feel it genuinely, and still recognize that it wasn't hers to fix. And for the first time, she experienced something unfamiliar: connection without self-abandonment, presence without depletion. This is the hallmark of integration. Not feeling less, but feeling from a center that doesn't collapse. What makes this stage so difficult is that it requires letting go of a certain kind of identity. The empath has been valuable precisely because they had no boundaries. They were the one who would always listen, always understand, always absorb. Their worth was tied to their availability. Developing structure means becoming less useful in that specific way. It means disappointing people who are accustomed to unlimited access. It means being seen as less giving, less patient, less good. And the temptation to return to the old pattern, to prove you're still the person everyone needs, can be overwhelming. But here's what becomes possible on the other side of that discomfort. A kind of presence that is actually sustainable. Not the exhausted presence of someone who's constantly depleted. Not the resentful presence of someone who gives because they can't say no. But a presence that comes from fullness, from choice, from a self that has finally been allowed to exist alongside others, rather than being absorbed by them. The empath who has developed this inner architecture still feels deeply, still perceives what others miss, still connects with genuine warmth, but they no longer disappear into those connections. They remain, and that remaining, that capacity to be present without being consumed, is not a diminishment of their gift. It's the condition that allows the gift to be given freely, rather than extracted endlessly. Chapter 6. Becoming who you are. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming who you actually are, beneath all the adaptations and identifications that accumulated over a lifetime. It sounds simple. It is not. Because becoming who you are requires first recognizing who you are not. And for the empath, that recognition is particularly brutal. It means seeing that the identity they've inhabited, the understanding one, the available one, the one who never says no, was never truly them. It was a role, a survival strategy, a persona constructed so early that it became indistinguishable from self. The process of individuation does not turn the empath into someone different. It reveals who they were before they learned to become what everyone needed. And this revelation is not always comfortable, because underneath the accommodating surface, there is often someone with strong preferences, clear limits, a capacity for anger that has been suppressed for decades, desires that don't align with being endlessly available, a self that has edges, that takes up space, that doesn't always want to understand. Meeting this self can feel like meeting a stranger. It can also feel like coming home. The exhaustion that defines so much of the empath's life begins to lift, not because they're doing less, but because they're no longer leaking energy into every interaction. They're no longer performing. They're no longer monitoring everyone's emotional state as a condition of safety. They're simply present, as themselves, with all the limits and preferences and inconvenient truths that come with being an actual person rather than a function. This transformation changes how they relate to others in ways that are both subtle and profound. They still care, but care is no longer synonymous with self-sacrifice. They still listen, but listening no longer means absorbing. They still show up for people they love, but showing up no longer requires abandoning themselves. And perhaps most significantly, they no longer need others to validate their goodness. Their worth is no longer contingent on being needed. They can be present without proving anything. They can love without disappearing. From the outside, this can look like they've become more distant, less available, more selfish. But those are surface readings. What's actually happened is that they've stopped offering what they don't have. They've stopped pretending to have infinite capacity. They've stopped performing a version of care that was always more about survival than love. And in the space that opens up when the performance ends, something more real becomes possible. Connection between two people who are both allowed to exist. Love that doesn't require one person's erasure. Presence that is mutual rather than extractive. If you trace the arc of this journey, from unconscious absorption, through the recognition of the invisible economy, through the cracking of the mask and the integration of the shadow, through the development of inner structure, to this final threshold of individuation, you see something that most discussions of empathy completely miss. The empath's gift was never the problem. The problem was that the gift was being extracted without consent. The problem was that there was no self strong enough to hold the gift. The problem was that caring had become a compulsion rather than a choice. And when that compulsion finally breaks, when the empath stops caring in the old, automatic, self-erasing way, they are not losing what made them special. They are finally becoming capable of offering it freely. Not because they have to, not because their worth depends on it, but because they have enough, because they are full enough, because they have finally learned to include themselves in the circle of care. Closing. So if you're in this place, if you feel yourself pulling back, if the old ways of relating no longer fit, if you sense that something fundamental is shifting but you don't yet have words for it, pause. What looks like loss from the outside may be the first honest thing that's happened in your inner life for years. What feels like becoming cold may actually be becoming coherent. What seems like abandoning others may finally be refusing to abandon yourself. The day the empath stops caring is not the day they lose what is most beautiful within them. It is the day they stop losing themselves in the act of loving. It is the day compassion becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. It is the day they begin to exist, not as a function for others, but as a person. And from that place, what they offer is no longer extracted from an empty well. It flows from a source that is finally being replenished. It is given, not surrendered. It is shared, not drained. Only when they no longer need to prove that they are good do they finally become whole. Only when they stop performing care do they discover what genuine care actually feels like. And only when they allow themselves to stop being what everyone else needs do they finally get to meet who they actually are. And if that recognition stirs something in you, something quiet but unmistakable, then perhaps you already know. The distance you feel is not emptiness, it's space. And space is not the absence of something, it's the condition for something new to emerge.